My name is Richard Hayward, and I'm telling you this story because I've carried it alone for 5 years now. That's long enough. I spent 32 years with the U.S. Forest Service as a wildlife biologist. Started in '87, retired in 2019. Most of that time was spent documenting predator-prey relationships in the Pacific Northwest: wolves, cougars, bear populations, elk migration corridors. I've published work in peer-reviewed journals. I've testified before congressional committees on wildlife management. I've spent more nights in the wilderness than most people spend in their own beds. I'm telling you this not to brag, but because you need to understand something. I know what lives in these mountains. I've studied it, tracked it, cataloged it for 3 decades. And what I saw in October 2019 wasn't in any of my field guides. The cost of keeping this quiet has been significant. My grandkids ask why I don't take them camping anymore. My wife notices I check the tree line when we're at the cabin, even in broad daylight. Old colleagues from the service call to catch up, and I find myself changing the subject whenever the conversation gets near the Cascade Range. You live with a thing like this long enough, it starts changing how you move through the world. But the real reason I'm breaking my silence now is simpler than that. There are others out there, credible people, professionals like me, who've seen things they can't explain and won't report because they know how it sounds. I've met a few of them since 2019. We find each other somehow, recognize that look in each other's eyes. And we stay quiet because we have careers to protect, reputations to maintain, families who depend on our credibility. This testimony is for them. You can believe it or not, that's your choice. But everything I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I describe it. In October 2019, I was 4 months into retirement and already going stir-crazy. My wife, Linda, suggested I get back to the field, do some independent research to keep my mind sharp. So I designed a simple study. Document elk migration patterns in the Clackamas River watershed. Same area I'd worked in the 90 seconds. Nothing fancy, just observation and notation. Something to fill my days with purpose. I applied for the proper permits, filed my research plan with the local ranger station, and packed up my truck with gear I'd been using for 15 years. I told Linda I'd be gone for a week, maybe 10 days, depending on elk activity. She kissed me goodbye and made me promise to check in via satellite phone every evening. I had no idea I was driving towards something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about North American fauna. The study was straightforward: set up an observation blind on a ridgeline overlooking the watershed, track elk movement through 3 valleys during their autumn migration, document any unusual predator activity. Basic field biology, the kind of work I could do in my sleep. I remember thinking, on that drive up to the trailhead, that this felt like coming home. The familiar weight of my pack, the smell of canvas and gun oil from my tent, the way my Swarovski spotting scope fit in its case like an old friend. I'd spent so many seasons in these mountains. I knew their rhythms, their sounds, their moods. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that something else knew those mountains even better. Something that had been watching researchers like me for decades, maybe longer. Learning our patterns, deciding when to reveal itself and when to stay hidden. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started with a routine field observation on my 4th morning out. October 18th, 2019. Clear skies, temperature around 45 degrees at dawn. Perfect conditions for spotting elk across the valley. It ended with 17 seconds that I replay in my mind every single day. The drive to the trailhead took me about 4 hours from Portland, most of it on Highway 224 following the Clackamas River east into the Cascades. I'd worked this watershed back in the mid-90 seconds during the northern spotted owl surveys, so the terrain was familiar even after 25 years. The last 12 miles were on Forest Service roads that most people don't even know exist, narrow, rutted tracks that require 4-wheel drive and a certain faith that your truck won't bottom out on the next boulder. I reached the trailhead parking area around 2 in the afternoon on October 14th. Nobody else there, which was exactly what I wanted. This late in the season, most recreational hikers have moved on to lower elevations. The serious hunters wouldn't arrive for another few weeks when rifle season opened. The hike to my chosen observation point was about 6 miles with 2,800 feet of elevation gain. I'd identified the location using topographic maps and satellite imagery, a ridgeline position that would give me sight lines across 3 major valleys where elk traditionally funneled through during their autumn movement. I was 57 years old and carrying 60 pounds of gear, so I took my time. No need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I reached the ridge just before dusk, set up my tent in a small depression sheltered from the wind, and spent the last hour of daylight glassing the valleys below with my binoculars. The Swarovski spotting scope would wait until morning when the light was better. I ate a cold dinner, didn't want campfire smoke announcing my presence, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through Douglas fir. The next 3 days fell into an easy rhythm. I'd wake before dawn, position myself at the observation blind I'd constructed from deadfall and camo netting, and spend the daylight hours watching elk. I documented a group of about 30 animals, mostly cows and calves with 2 younger bulls, moving through the Eastern Valley. Standard autumn behavior. I noted their feeding patterns, rest periods, and travel routes in my field notebook using the same meticulous notation system I'd developed over 3 decades. Everything was exactly as it should be, comfortable even. The weather held clear and cold. My gear worked perfectly. The Swarovski scope, which I'd bought used in 2004 and had serviced regularly ever since, gave me crystal views at 60x magnification. I could count individual elk at 800 yards, read their body language, identify which animals were dominant by watching their interactions. On October 17th, I documented the elk moving into the Western Valley, likely heading toward lower elevation feeding grounds. That evening, I called Linda on the satellite phone, as promised. She asked how the research was going. I told her it was perfect, exactly the kind of simple, clean field work I needed. I didn't sleep well that night, though I couldn't tell you why. Nothing specific bothered me. No unusual sounds, no disturbances at camp. Just a vague sense of unease that I attributed to the barometric pressure dropping. Mountain weather changes can affect you that way sometimes. The morning of October 18th started normally enough. I was at my observation position by 6:15 a.m., just as the eastern sky was beginning to show color. The temperature was around 40 degrees, dropping to the mid-30s overnight. I poured coffee from my thermos, pulled on my gloves with the fingertips cut off for precision work, and positioned the Swarovski scope toward the valley where I'd last seen the elk herd. That's when I noticed the silence. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that true silence is rare. There's almost always something: birds calling, squirrels moving through branches, the wind itself creating sound as it passes through the forest. But that morning, everything felt muted. Not exactly quiet, just absent. The elk were nervous too. I could see them through the scope, about 25 animals clustered tighter than usual in the western. Their heads were up, ears forward, focused on something I couldn't see. The 2 bulls were positioned on the outside of the group, protective posture, classic threat response. I scanned the surrounding terrain looking for what had them spooked. Cougar, maybe, or wolves, though we didn't have an established pack in this watershed. Bears should have been denning up by now, but you never knew. I found the bull elk I'd been tracking for 3 days, magnificent 6-point, probably 5 years old, good weight on him. I centered him in my scope at approximately 800 yards, watching his behavior, making mental notes for my field log. That's when something massive moved into frame behind him. My mouth went dry. Not nervous dry, the kind where your body knows something before your brain catches up. The figure was bipedal. That was the first thing that registered. Walking upright across an exposed talus slope with a gait that was fluid and purposeful, nothing like the lumber of a bear on its hind legs. It was covered in dark auburn hair that caught the morning light as it moved, and it was carrying something over its right shoulder, a deer quarter. The hind quarter of what looked like a mule deer, draped across its shoulder with the same ease you'd carry a jacket. For 17 seconds, I've counted it out so many times since I watched this thing cross that slope. My hands were shaking so badly I almost lost it in the scope. I tried to keep my breathing steady, tried to maintain my professional observation skills, tried to document what I was seeing the way I documented thousands of wildlife encounters before. But this wasn't like anything I'd ever documented. The creature moved with intelligence, not animal instinct conscious, calculated movement. It knew the terrain, knew where to place each step on that talus field where a wrong move would send you sliding 50 feet down loose rock. The weight it was carrying would have been 60, maybe 70 pounds, and it moved like it was nothing. Then it paused, turned its head to scan the valley, and I saw its profile. It was primate. That much was undeniable. Heavy brow ridge, flat nose, a jaw structure that was wrong for any ape I'd ever studied or seen in photographs. The profile lasted maybe 2 seconds before the creature turned away, but those 2 seconds burned themselves into my memory with the kind of clarity that doesn't fade. I watched it adjust the deer quarter on its shoulder, a deliberate movement, conscious and calculated. The way you'd shift a heavy pack to redistribute weight. Then it continued across the talus slope and disappeared into the tree line on the far side. 17 seconds total. I know because I've counted it out 1,000 times since, trying to convince myself I saw something else. A person in a suit. A bear standing upright. Some kind of visual distortion caused by the scope's magnification or the morning light hitting the slope at a strange angle. But I know what I saw. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to set down the scope and just breathe for a minute. 32 years of field work, and I'd never had a reaction like that. I've been charged by a grizzly in Yellowstone. I've had a cougar stalk me for 2 miles through the Trinity Alps. I've found fresh wolf kills that were still warm. None of it affected me the way those 17 seconds did. Something primitive in my brain knew I'd just witnessed something that wasn't supposed to exist. I fumbled for my camera, a Canon with a 400mm lens that I kept in my pack specifically for wildlife documentation. My fingers felt thick and clumsy as I pulled it out, nearly dropping it twice. By the time I had it up and focused on the tree line where the figure had vanished, there was nothing but Douglas fir and shadow. I took photographs anyway. The talus slope, the tree line, the general area where I'd observed the creature. The images would be useless without the subject, but documentation is a reflex after 3 decades of fieldwork. You record what you can, even when your hands won't stop shaking. Then I grabbed my field notebook, the same weathered Write in the Rain book I'd been using all week, and started writing. I noted the time. 6:47 a.m. The temperature, approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The location, Western Valley, talus slope at bearing 284 degrees from my position. Estimated distance, 800 yards. I sketched what I'd seen, trying to capture the proportions, the way it moved, the profile when it turned. My handwriting was nearly illegible. I had to force myself to slow down, to be methodical. This was evidence, and evidence required precision. I wrote, bipedal figure, approximately 7 to 8 feet tall based on comparative analysis, with surrounding terrain features. Dark auburn hair covering entire body. Carrying what appeared to be hindquarter of mule deer, estimated 60 to 70 pounds, over right shoulder. Gait fluid and purposeful, showing confidence in terrain navigation. Mid-stride length estimated at 5 to 6 feet. Paused once to scan valley movement. Suggested conscious awareness and assessment of surroundings. Profile visible for approximately 2 seconds. Heavy brow ridge. Flat nose, jaw structure, inconsistent with known North American fauna. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, just staring at what I'd written. Part of me wanted to tear out the page and pretend it never happened. I knew how this would sound. I knew what it would do to my credibility if I reported this. But I also knew I couldn't ignore it. I returned to the Swarovski scope and spent the next 3 hours studying that talus slope. I documented the exact path the creature had taken, noting how it had chosen the most efficient route across unstable terrain. I measured angles, estimated the slope gradient, calculated the physics of what I'd witnessed. A human couldn't move like that while carrying 70 pounds. The center of gravity would be wrong. The stride, length, impossible to maintain on loose rock at that angle. The elk were long gone by then, of course. Whatever had spooked them that morning had scattered the herd into the thick timber where I couldn't track them. I should have been disappointed my entire research plan depended on observing their movement patterns, but I couldn't bring myself to care about elk anymore. I kept coming back to that moment when it turned its head. The intelligence in that movement. It wasn't scanning randomly, it was assessing. Looking for threats, maybe, or just aware of its surroundings in a way that suggested complex thinking. Around 10 o'clock, I packed up my observation equipment and hiked back to my main camp. I needed to think, to process what I'd seen and decide what to do about it. The rational part of my brain, the scientist who'd spent 3 decades building a reputation for careful, methodical research, was screaming at me to be skeptical, to find alternative explanations, to consider every possible scenario before jumping to impossible conclusions. But I couldn't shake what my eyes had shown me. I sat in my tent that afternoon, eating a cold lunch I barely tasted, and made a decision. I had to investigate the site. I had to find out if there was physical evidence, tracks, scat, hair samples, anything that could be documented and analyzed. If this thing was real, it would leave traces. And if those traces existed, I needed to find them before weather, or scavengers erased them. The descent from my ridgeline position to the valley floor would take at least 3 hours. The talus slope where I'd seen the creature was on the far side of the valley, which meant crossing rough terrain with limited daylight remaining. If I left now, I could reach the site by mid-afternoon, spend an hour or two investigating, and still make it back to camp before full dark. It would be close, and it would be pushing my limits. I wasn't 25 anymore, and 60 pounds of gear had felt heavier on this trip than I wanted to admit. But some things are worth the risk. I repacked my day pack with essentials: camera, GPS unit, evidence bags, measuring tape, field notebook, water, and basic safety gear. I marked my intended route on the topographic map and left a note in my tent with my plans and estimated return time. Old habits from my days leading field crews always tell someone where you're going, even if that someone is just a note you hope nobody ever has to find. The hike down started easy enough. I followed game trails where I could, using my knowledge of the terrain to find the most efficient routes. But the closer I got to the valley floor, the more my unease grew. The forest felt different than it had all week. Too quiet, maybe. Or just different in a way I couldn't quite name. By the time I reached the base of the talus slope where the creature had crossed, it was nearly 3 in the afternoon. The temperature had climbed to the mid-50s, warm enough that I'd worked up a sweat during the descent. I stopped to drink water and catch my breath, studying the tree line where I'd last seen the figure. Then I started searching for tracks. It took me 15 minutes of careful examination, working in a grid pattern the way I'd been trained for wildlife surveys. The talus field itself was too loose and rocky to hold prints, but at the edge, where it met soft earth and pine duff, I found what I was looking for. A footprint. 14 inches long, maybe 7 inches wide at the ball. 5 distinct toe impressions, each showing what looked like dermal ridges, the kind of fine detail that's impossible to fake. The depth suggested significant weight, and when I measured the distance to the next clear print, my measuring tape showed a stride length of just under 6 feet. My blood went cold despite the afternoon warmth. I knelt there in the dirt, staring at that print, and knew my life had just changed in ways I couldn't predict. I took 43 photographs of that first track from every angle I could think of, with my hand for scale, with my measuring tape showing the length and width. Close-ups of the toe impressions and what appeared to be dermal ridges in the soil, wide shots showing its position relative to the surrounding terrain. My camera's timestamp would later show I spent 18 minutes documenting a single footprint. Part of me was still hoping I'd find some explanation that didn't involve an unknown primate species in the Oregon Cascades. Maybe this was an elaborate hoax, someone with custom-made prosthetic feet hiking out here to create false evidence. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I knew it didn't make sense. This wasn't near any trail system. There was no audience out here. No one to fool except a lone wildlife biologist who wasn't supposed to be in this specific valley on this specific day. And the print itself showed details that would be nearly impossible to fabricate. The way the soil compressed under the ball of the foot, the natural variation in toe placement, the depth consistent with the weight distribution of something moving at a walking pace across uneven ground. I documented enough bear and cougar tracks over 3 decades to recognize authentic wildlife sign. This had that same quality of realness, the kind of evidence that emerges from an actual living creature interacting with its environment, not from someone trying to create a convincing fake. I found the second print 6 feet away, exactly where the stride length suggested it would be. Then a third, then a fourth. A clear trackway leading from the talus slope into the forest. I followed it. The rational part of my brain was raising objections. I was alone. It was already after 3 in the afternoon, and I was tracking something large and unknown into dense timber. Everything about this violated basic wilderness safety protocols. But I couldn't stop myself. This was evidence. Real, physical, documentable evidence of something that shouldn't exist, and I had to follow it to wherever it led. The trackway continued into the forest, becoming harder to spot on the needle-covered ground, but still visible where the creature had stepped on softer soil or disturbed the duff. I moved slowly, stopping every few yards to photograph and measure, noting the natural variation in the gait pattern. The prints showed mid-tarsal flexibility, a trait found in apes but not in humans, where the midfoot is rigid due to our longitudinal arch. Another detail that would be difficult to fake, and one that most hoaxers probably wouldn't even know to include. About 200 yards into the forest, I found where the creature had apparently stopped to rest. There was a depression in the pine needles where something heavy had been set down the deer quarter, I assumed, and a larger area where the creature itself might have sat or knelt. I took photographs, then carefully collected some of the disturbed pine needles in an evidence bag. Maybe there would be hair samples mixed in. Maybe something that could be DNA tested. The trackway continued deeper into the timber. I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. The sun would set around 6:30 this time of year, maybe 7 if I was lucky. I had maybe 3 hours of good daylight left, and I was already a solid 45 minutes from the valley floor. If I wanted to make it back to my camp before dark, I needed to turn around soon. But the tracks led on, and I kept following. 10 minutes later, the forest opened into a small clearing, maybe 30 yards across, and there, in the center, I found the deer. What was left of it, anyway. The carcass had been systematically dismantled. That's the only word I can use that captures what I was seeing. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of a predator kill, where meat is torn away in chunks and bones are scattered by feeding. This was methodical, purposeful. The remaining skeleton was largely intact and articulated, but every scrap of meat had been removed from the bones. The rib cage had been cracked open, not smashed, but cracked along specific stress points to access the organs. The leg bones showed clean breaks consistent with someone or something extracting the marrow. I stood at the edge of that clearing for a long moment, just processing what I was seeing. Then my forensic training kicked in, and I started documenting. I photographed the carcass from multiple angles. I took close-ups of the bone breaks, noting how clean they were, no tooth marks, no ragged edges from tearing. I examined the rib cage and found what looked like impact points, where something had struck the bone with enough force to crack it, but with enough control not to shatter it completely. Near the carcass, I found several stones that showed signs of recent use. Dark staining that could have been blood. Impact fractures suggesting they'd been used for percussion striking against other hard surfaces. One piece of basalt showed a crude but functional edge, the kind you might get from striking one rock against another at the right angle to create a sharp flake. And then I found the obsidian. It was about 4 inches long, shaped into a rough blade with a sharp cutting edge along one side. Obsidian isn't native to this immediate area. The nearest known source was probably 50 miles south. Someone or something had either carried this here or manufactured it from traded material. I picked it up carefully, using a leaf so I wouldn't contaminate it with my own DNA, and placed it in an evidence bag. My hands were steady now. The initial adrenaline had faded, replaced by a kind of focused intensity I remembered from my early field days. This was evidence collection. This was documentation. This was the kind of work I'd spent my career doing, even if the subject was something I'd never encountered before. I took measurements of the clearing. I documented the position of the carcass relative to the surrounding trees. I collected samples of the stained stones, careful not to disturb the site any more than necessary. I sketched diagrams in my field notebook, noting every detail I could observe. And then, I noticed the light was fading. I checked my watch again. 5:23 p.m. The sun was already low enough that the forest was filling with shadow, and I was at least an hour and a half from my camp if I pushed hard. Longer if I took my time navigating in failing light. I needed to leave. Now, I took one last series of photographs, then marked the clearing's location on my GPS unit. I could come back tomorrow with better equipment, more evidence bags, maybe even a portable scale to weigh some of the bones and estimate how much force would be required to break them. But right now, I needed to get back to camp before full dark. The hike out was harder than the hike in. I was tired, my legs were starting to cramp from the elevation changes, and I kept having to stop to check my GPS to make sure I was heading the right direction. The forest looks different in twilight, and it's easy to get turned around even in terrain you think you know. By the time I reached the valley floor, it was after 6:30 and the light was nearly gone. I still had the 3-hour climb back up to my ridgeline camp, and I was going to have to do most of it in darkness. I pulled out my headlamp and started climbing. I want to tell you about that hike back to camp, because it's important you understand what changed in those 3 hours. When I started the climb out of the valley, I was still operating in scientist mode. My pack was heavier now, with the evidence bags, the obsidian blade wrapped carefully in cloth, the stained stones, the pine needle samples. My field notebook had fresh pages of documentation. My camera's memory card held hundreds of photographs. I had physical evidence of something extraordinary, and part of me was already thinking about how to present it, who to contact, which colleagues might be willing to examine the material without dismissing it outright. But the forest felt different in the failing light. I've done plenty of night hiking over the years. It's part of the job when you're tracking wildlife. Animals don't keep business hours, and sometimes you end up miles from camp when the sun goes down. I've always been comfortable in the dark woods. Respectful of the hazards, sure, but not afraid. That night was different. I kept my headlamp on its lowest setting to preserve battery, using just enough light to see the trail ahead and avoid turning an ankle on loose rock. The beam created a small bubble of visibility, maybe 10 feet in diameter, and beyond that was darkness so complete it felt solid. The usual night sounds were their wind moving through the canopy, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of a great horned owl. Normal wilderness sounds, nothing unusual. But about 40 minutes into the climb, I started hearing something else. Movement, parallel to my position, maybe 50 yards off to my left. Something large enough to make noise despite moving through the forest, but not making the kind of crashing sounds you'd expect from an elk or bear pushing through brush. This was more deliberate, more careful. I stopped, turned off my headlamp, let my eyes adjust to the darkness. For maybe 30 seconds, I stood there listening. The movement had stopped when I stopped. The forest around me was quiet, that same unnatural silence I'd noticed that morning before the sighting. Then I heard it. A single sound, like two pieces of wood knocked together, sharp and deliberate, coming from the direction of the movement. Wood knocking. I'd heard about it in Bigfoot reports, always dismissed it as coincidence or misidentified sounds, but this was unmistakable. Someone or something had struck two objects together to make that sound, and it had happened right after I stopped moving. My heart was hammering now. I turned my headlamp back on and kept walking, trying to maintain a steady pace. Trying not to run, because running in the dark on unfamiliar terrain is a good way to get hurt. But every instinct I had was screaming at me to move faster. The parallel movement continued, staying roughly the same distance away, pacing me as I climbed. I'd walk for 5 minutes, hear something moving through the timber to my left. I'd stop, and the movement would stop. Then another would knock, closer this time. This went on for over an hour. I want to be clear about something. I never saw what was following me. Never got a visual confirmation. Everything I experienced could, theoretically, be explained by coincidence, by animal behavior I was misinterpreting, by my own fear adding meaning to random sounds. But I've spent 32 years in the wilderness. I know what it feels like to be observed by wildlife, the prickly awareness you get when a cougar is tracking you, or the way your body responds before your conscious mind registers that something large is nearby. This was that feeling amplified 100-fold. Something was following me, and it wanted me to know it. Around 9:30, I finally reached the area where my camp was located. The last quarter mile before the ridgeline, the trees thin out and the terrain opens up enough that nothing large could approach without being visible. The parallel movement had stopped about 10 minutes earlier, right at the tree line. I reached my tent at 10:17 p.m. according to my watch. I'd been hiking for nearly 6.5 hours, and I was exhausted. My legs were cramping. My back ached from the pack. I was dehydrated and hungry and running on pure adrenaline. I should have eaten something, should have rehydrated properly, taken care of basic needs. Instead, I sat outside my tent with my headlamp pointed at the tree line, listening. The night sounds had returned, normal forest sounds, nothing unusual. Whatever had been pacing me through the darkness had either left or was staying well back in the timber. I eventually forced myself to get up, to go through the evening routine. I ate a cold meal I barely tasted. I drank water until I stopped feeling dizzy. I checked my camera to make sure the images had saved properly. They had hundreds of them. I secured the evidence bags in my pack, double-checking that everything was properly sealed and labeled. Then I sat in my tent with my satellite phone in one hand and my knife in the other, trying to decide what to do. I could call Linda, tell her what I'd found. But what would I say? That I'd seen something that shouldn't exist, that I had evidence of tool use by an unknown primate, that something had followed me through the forest for over an hour? She'd tell me to pack up and come home. Hell, she'd probably call search and rescue if she thought I was having some kind of episode. I could call Tom Morrison at the ranger station, file an official report right now, while everything was fresh. But I knew how that conversation would go. Tom would be professional about it, but I'd hear the skepticism in his voice. He'd suggest I was overtired, that I'd misidentified something ordinary, that the stress of retirement was affecting my judgment, Or I could wait, document everything properly, collect more evidence, build an ironclad case before I told anyone what I'd found. I chose to wait. I'm still not sure if that was the right decision. I spent most of that night awake, lying in my tent and listening to sounds outside that I couldn't identify. Subtle things, the snap of a twig, the rustle of something moving through undergrowth, occasional sounds that might have been breathing or might have been wind. Around 3 a.m, I heard another wood knock, single strike, maybe 200 yards away, then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I dozed in and out, jerking awake at every sound, my hand finding the knife I'd placed next to my sleeping bag. By the time dawn started showing in the eastern sky, I was exhausted and wired at the same time, running on nervous energy and way too much coffee from my thermos. The temperature had dropped to the mid-30s overnight. My breath formed clouds in the cold air as I packed up my observation equipment. I'd made a decision during those sleepless hours. I was heading home. Not permanently. I'd come back, properly prepared, with better equipment and maybe someone else along for safety. But I needed to get this evidence to people who could analyze it. I needed to document what I'd found while the details were still fresh. And if I'm being honest, I needed to get away from these mountains for a while. I broke camp methodically, making sure I hadn't left anything behind. I took one last look at the valleys below through my Swarovski scope, scanning the areas where I'd observed the creature. Nothing moved except a pair of ravens circling over the eastern ridge. The hike back to my truck took about 4 hours. Full daylight, easy navigation, and I pushed the pace despite my exhaustion. I kept checking over my shoulder, kept scanning the tree line, kept listening for any indication of the parallel movement from the night before. Nothing. The forest felt normal again. Almost like the previous 12 hours had been some kind of fever dream. But the evidence bags in my pack were real. The photographs on my camera were real. And the memory of those 17 seconds watching something impossible cross a talus slope was burned into my brain with perfect clarity. I reached my truck around 1 p.m, loaded my gear, and started the long drive back towards civilization. I had the satellite phone next to me on the passenger seat, and about halfway down the Forest Service road, I pulled over and called Linda. "Hey," I said when she answered. "I'm coming home early. Is everything okay?" Her voice had that note of concern that comes from 3 decades of, quote, marriage. She could hear something was off. "Yeah, I'm fine. I need to wrap up this project from home, analyze some data, write up my findings. Richard," she was using her serious voice now. "What happened? I'll tell you when I get there, I promise. But Linda?" I paused, watching the tree line in my rearview mirror. "I'm going to need you to trust me on something. Trust that I know what I saw, even when it doesn't make sense." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Drive safe. I'll have dinner ready when you get home. That's what 30 years of marriage gets you. Someone who knows when not to push, who will wait for the full story, who will trust you even when you're asking them to believe the impossible." I got back to Portland around 6 that evening. Linda took one look at my face and knew better than to ask questions right away. She heated up leftovers while I unloaded my gear, moving like I was on autopilot. We ate dinner, making small talk about her week, about our daughter's new job in Seattle, about anything except what I had experienced in the Cascades. After dinner, we sat on the back porch with coffee, and I told her everything. To her credit, she listened without interrupting. Didn't laugh, didn't suggest I was mistaken, didn't offer any of the easy explanations I'd been running through in my own head. She just listened while I described those 17 seconds. The trackway, the butchered deer, the evidence of tool use, the terrifying hike back to camp. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Show me the photographs." We spent the next hour going through the images on my camera's screen. The tracks with their clear dermal ridges, the methodically dismantled deer carcass, the obsidian blade that shouldn't exist in that location, the stones showing signs of use as tools. "What are you going to do with this?" she finally asked. "I don't know yet. I need to figure out who to talk to, who might take it seriously. Richard," she put her hand on my arm. "You know how this is going to sound. I know. It's going to cost you. Your reputation, probably. People you've worked with for decades are going to look at you differently. I know that too," she nodded slowly. "Then you need to be sure, really sure. Because once you put this out there, you can't take it back." I looked at the image on my camera's screen, a perfect 14-inch footprint with visible toe impressions and what appeared to be dermal ridges, physical evidence of something that shouldn't exist. "I'm sure," I said, but I wasn't. Not really. Not yet. The next morning, I drove to the Clackamas Ranger Station to file my report with Tom Morrison. I took 43 photographs of that first track from every angle I could think of. With my hand for scale, with my measuring tape showing the length and width, close-ups of the toe impressions and what appeared to be dermal ridges in the soil, wide shots showing its position relative to the surrounding terrain. My camera's timestamp would later show I spent 18 minutes documenting a single footprint. Part of me was still hoping I'd find some explanation that didn't involve an unknown primate species in the Oregon Cascades. Maybe this was an elaborate hoax, someone with custom-made prosthetic feet hiking out here to create false evidence. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I knew it didn't make sense. This wasn't near any trail system. There was no audience out here, no one to fool except a lone wildlife biologist who wasn't supposed to be in this specific valley on this specific day. And the print itself showed details that would be nearly impossible to fabricate. The way the soil compressed under the ball of the foot, the natural variation in toe placement, the depth consistent with the weight distribution of something moving at a walking pace across uneven ground. I documented enough bear and cougar tracks over 3 decades to recognize authentic wildlife sign. This had that same quality of realness, the kind of evidence that emerges from an actual living creature interacting with its environment, not from someone trying to create a convincing fake. I found the second print 6 feet away, exactly where the stride length suggested it would be. Then a third, then a fourth, a clear trackway leading from the talus slope into the forest. The rational part of my brain was raising objections. I was alone, it was already after 3 in the afternoon, and I was tracking something large and unknown into dense timber. Everything about this violated basic wilderness safety protocols, but I couldn't stop myself. This was evidence. Real, physical, documentable evidence of something that shouldn't exist, and I had to follow it to wherever it led. The trackway continued into the forest, becoming harder to spot on the needle-covered ground, but still visible where the creature had stepped on softer soil or disturbed the duff. I moved slowly, stopping every few yards to photograph and measure, noting the natural variation in the gait pattern. The prints showed mid-tarsal flexibility, a trait found in apes but not in humans, where the midfoot is rigid due to our longitudinal arch. Another detail that would be difficult to fake, and one that most hoaxers probably wouldn't even know to include. About 200 yards into the forest, I found where the creature had apparently stopped to rest. There was a depression in the pine needles where something heavy had been set down the deer quarter, I assumed, in a larger area where the creature itself might have sat or knelt. The pine needles were compressed in a pattern that suggested significant weight distributed over a broad surface. Not a bear print, not human, something else. I took photographs, then carefully collected some of the disturbed pine needles in an evidence bag. Maybe there would be hair samples mixed in. Maybe something that could be DNA tested, though I wasn't sure who I'd trust with that kind of analysis. The trackway continued deeper into the timber, and I followed for another 10 minutes until the forest opened into a small clearing, maybe 30 yards across. That's where I found the deer, what was left of it anyway. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, just processing what I was seeing. The carcass had been systematically dismantled. That's the only word I can use that captures what I was looking at. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of a predator kill, where meat is torn away in chunks and bones are scattered by feeding. This was methodical, purposeful. The remaining skeleton was largely intact and articulated, but every scrap of meat had been removed from the bones. The rib cage had been cracked open, not smashed, but cracked along specific stress points to access the organs. The leg bones showed clean breaks consistent with someone or something extracting the marrow. I've seen hundreds of kill sites over my career. Bear kills, cougar kills, wolf kills, coyote scavenging. Each predator leaves a signature in how they process a carcass. This didn't match any of them. I stood at the edge of that clearing for a long moment, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun dropped lower. My scientific training was fighting with something more primal, the understanding that I was looking at evidence of intelligence, not instinct, not simple predation, but deliberate, methodical processing of a food source in ways that suggested planning and capability. I checked my watch. 4:47 p.m. The sun would set around 6:30. I had maybe 2 hours of good light left, and I was at least 90 minutes from my camp if I pushed hard, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without documenting this properly. I pulled out my field notebook and started making careful observations, fighting the urge to rush. This was too important to do halfway. I approached the carcass slowly, photographing as I moved closer. The deer had been a mule deer doe, probably 3 or 4 years old based on the bone structure. Medium-sized, maybe 140 pounds when alive. The kind of animal that any large predator in these mountains could take down. But what happened after the kill, that's what made my hands tremble as I documented it. The rib cage drew my attention first. The ribs had been cracked systematically, creating an opening to access the internal organs. But they weren't broken randomly. Each fracture point showed evidence of deliberate force applied at specific angles. I photographed the breaks from multiple angles, noting how they'd been created by impact rather than tearing or crushing. Something had struck the ribs with enough force to crack them, but with enough control not to shatter them completely. The leg bones told a similar story. The femurs had been broken to access the marrow, but the breaks were clean, the kind you'd see from percussion, from striking the bone against a hard surface or using a tool to fracture it along natural stress lines. The ends had been cracked open and the marrow extracted, leaving hollow bone fragments scattered around the site. I knelt next to the carcass, my camera documenting every detail while my mind tried to process the implications. This level of methodical processing required understanding of anatomy, knowledge of where the most nutritious parts were located, the capability to use tools or techniques to access them efficiently. That's when I found the stones. They were scattered around the kill site river rocks about the size of my fist, showing recent use. I picked one up carefully, using a leaf so I wouldn't contaminate it with my own DNA. The stone had dark staining that could have been blood. Impact fractures on one end suggested it had been used for percussion striking against other hard surfaces. I bagged it as evidence, then found 2 more stones showing similar wear patterns. One piece of basalt had a crude but functional edge, the kind you might get from striking one. Rock against another at the right angle to create a sharp flake. And then I found the obsidian. It was about 4 inches long, shaped into a rough blade with a sharp cutting edge along one side. Obsidian isn't native to this immediate area. The nearest known source was probably 50 miles south. Someone or something had either carried this here or manufactured it from traded material. I held it carefully, examining the edge in the fading light. It showed signs of microscopic chips along the cutting surface that suggested it had been used to slice through tough material, possibly hide, possibly sinew, the kind of wear pattern you'd see on a tool that had been used for butchering. My mouth went dry. This wasn't just evidence of tool use, this was evidence of tool manufacturing. The cognitive leap required to create a cutting implement from raw material that's not something any known North American predator could do. I photographed the obsidian blade from every angle, then carefully wrapped it in cloth and placed it in an evidence bag. My hands were steadier now. The initial shock had faded, replaced by the focused intensity of documentation. This was extraordinary evidence, and I needed to preserve every detail. I spent the next 30 minutes examining the rest of the site. I found where the creature had apparently sorted different parts of the carcass bones in one area to hide fragments in another. The hide had been separated from the meat with clean cuts that no claw or tooth could make. Under magnification, I could see the cut marks were consistent with a sharp stone edge drawn repeatedly along the same line. The skull was missing entirely, either carried away or buried somewhere nearby. The spine had been disarticulated at several points, suggesting knowledge of joint structure and how to separate vertebrae efficiently. Everything pointed to intelligence, not just animal cunning or instinctive behavior, but actual problem-solving capability, understanding of anatomy, tool manufacture and use, systematic processing of a food source to maximize nutritional value. I took measurements of the clearing, documented the position of the carcass relative to the surrounding trees, collected samples of the stained stones. I sketched diagrams in my field notebook, noting every detail I could observe, and then I noticed the light was failing. I checked my watch again. 5:23 p.m. The sun was already low enough that the forest was filling with shadow. I needed to leave. Now. I took one last series of photographs, then marked the clearing's location on my GPS unit. I could come back tomorrow with better equipment, more evidence bags, maybe even a portable scale to weigh some of the bones and estimate how much force would be required to break them. But right now, I needed to get back to camp before full dark. I started hiking, moving as quickly as I dared through terrain that was growing dimmer by the minute. I kept thinking about what I'd found, about the systematic butchery, the tool use, the evidence of planning and capability. This wasn't just an unknown animal. This was an unknown intelligence sharing these mountains with us. Something that understood anatomy and nutrition, that manufactured tools and used them effectively, that processed food sources with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested cultural knowledge passed down through generations. And I documented it. I had photographs, physical evidence, GPS coordinates, detailed observations, everything a scientist could want, except anyone to share it with who wouldn't think I'd lost my mind. The forest was nearly dark now, and I still had at least an hour of hiking ahead of me. I pulled out my headlamp and kept moving, trying not to think about what might be watching me from the shadows, trying not to wonder if the intelligence that had created those tools and processed that carcass knew I'd been there, knew I'd documented everything, and might be deciding what to do about the human who'd found evidence that shouldn't exist. I want to tell you about that hike back to camp because it's important you understand what changed in those 3 hours. When I started the climb out of the valley, I was still operating in scientist mode. My pack was heavier now, with the evidence bags, the obsidian blade wrapped carefully in cloth, the stained stones, the pine needle samples. My field notebook had fresh pages of documentation. My camera's memory card held hundreds of photographs. I had physical evidence of something extraordinary. But the forest felt different in the failing light. I've done plenty of night hiking over the years. It's part of the job when you're tracking wildlife. Animals don't keep business hours. I've always been comfortable in the dark woods, respectful of the hazards, but not afraid. That night was different. I kept my headlamp on its lowest setting to preserve battery, using just enough light to see the trail ahead. The beam created a small bubble of visibility, maybe 10 feet in diameter, and beyond that was darkness so complete it felt solid. About 40 minutes into the climb, I started hearing something else, movement. Parallel to my position, maybe 50 yards off to my left, something large enough to make noise despite moving through the forest, but not making the kind of crashing sounds you'd expect from an elk or bear. This was more deliberate, more careful. I stopped, turned off my headlamp, let my eyes adjust to the darkness. For maybe 30 seconds, I stood there listening. The movement had stopped when I stopped. The forest around me was quiet, that same unnatural silence I'd noticed that morning before the sighting. Then I heard it, a single sound, like two pieces of wood knocked together, sharp and deliberate, coming from the direction of the movement. I'd heard about wood knocking in Bigfoot. Reports always dismissed it as coincidence. But this was unmistakable. Someone, or something, had struck two objects together to make that sound, and it had happened right after I stopped moving. My heart was hammering. I turned my headlamp back on and kept walking, trying to maintain a steady pace. The parallel movement continued, staying roughly the same distance away, pacing me as I climbed. I'd walk for 5 minutes, hear something moving through the timber. I'd stop, and the movement would stop. Then another would knock, closer this time. This went on for over an hour. I never saw what was following me, never got visual confirmation. Everything I experienced could theoretically be explained by coincidence, by my own fear adding meaning to random sounds. But I've spent 32 years in the wilderness. I know what it feels like to be observed by wildlife. This was that feeling amplified 100-fold. Something was following me, and it wanted me to know it. Around 9:30, I finally reached my camp. The last quarter mile, the trees thin out enough that nothing large could approach without being visible. The parallel movement had stopped right at the tree line. I reached my tent, exhausted and shaken. My legs were cramping from the elevation changes. I was dehydrated and hungry and running on pure adrenaline. I should have taken care of basic needs, eating, drinking, proper rest. Instead, I sat outside my tent with my headlamp pointed at the tree line, listening. The night sounds had returned normal forest sounds. Whatever had been pacing me had either left or was staying back in the timber where I couldn't detect it. Eventually, I forced myself to eat, to drink water until I stopped feeling dizzy, to check my camera and make sure all the images had saved properly, to secure the evidence bags in my pack. Then I sat in my tent with my satellite phone in one hand and my knife in the other, trying to decide what to do. I spent most of that night awake, listening to sounds outside that I couldn't identify. Around 3 a.m, I heard another wood knock. Single strike, maybe 200 yards away. Then nothing. The Clackamas Ranger Station sits about 15 miles east of Estacada, a low brown building that blends into the forest. I'd been there dozens of times over my career. Tom Morrison had been the district ranger for maybe 8 years, and we'd worked together on enough projects that I considered him a colleague, if not quite a friend. I pulled into the parking lot around 9:30 on the morning of October 20th, exhausted from a sleepless night. 2 other vehicles were there, Tom's Forest Service truck and a volunteer's sedan. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, rehearsing what I was going to say. I'd been up half the night organizing my thoughts, reviewing my photographs, making sure my documentation was thorough and professional. The evidence bags were in my pack. My field notebook was filled with measurements and observations. On paper, I had a solid case. In practice, I was about to walk into a ranger station and claim I'd found evidence of Bigfoot. Tom was at his desk when I walked in. He looked up and smiled. "Richard, didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Wrapped up early," I said. "Got some results I wanted to discuss with you." His smile faded slightly. "All right, come on back." His office was small topographic maps on the walls, filing cabinets, a window looking out at Douglas firs. He gestured to a chair and settled into his own seat. "So what'd you find?" I took a breath. On October 18th, at approximately 6:47 a.m., I observed a large bipedal figure crossing a talus slope in the Western Valley. The figure was approximately 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark auburn hair, and was carrying what appeared to be the hindquarter of a mule deer. Tom didn't say anything. His face had gone very still. I subsequently found a trackway showing 14-inch footprints. I followed it to a clearing where I found the deer carcass, which had been systematically butchered using what appears to be stone tools. I pulled out my field notebook. I have photographs, measurements, coordinates, and physical evidence. Tom looked at the items on his desk like they might bite him. "Richard, you're telling me you saw a Bigfoot?" "I'm telling you I observed something I can't identify, something demonstrating tool use and intelligent behavior." He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "How long have we known each other?" 10 years. About that. "So you know, I respect your work." He paused. "Which is why this is difficult. Because if anyone else came in here with this story, I'd smile and nod and file it away. But you're Richard Hayward, and that makes this complicated." "I'm aware of how it sounds." "Are you?" He leaned forward. "Richard, I have to ask, how are you doing? Really, retirement can be tough. The stress of trying to prove you've still got it. I'm not having an episode, Tom. I'm saying that the mind can play tricks. You could have seen a bear. It wasn't a bear." He picked up my field notebook, flipped through a few pages. His expression didn't change. "The photographs. At least look at the photographs." He took my camera and I walked him through the images. The trackway, the footprints, the systematically butchered carcass, the stones, the obsidian blade. He looked at each one carefully. "These are inconclusive," he said finally. "The tracks could be fabricated. These stones could just be rocks, Richard. Then come out there with me. I'll show you the site, Richard." He set the camera down. "I can't justify using resources to investigate a Bigfoot sighting, and I especially can't do it when the report comes from someone who might be going through a difficult transition." I felt something cold settle in my chest. I'm not having a breakdown. "Think about how this looks. Is this really how you want to end your career?" I gathered up my evidence bags and notebook. "I want this conversation documented. I'm filing an official report. You can classify it however you want, but I want it on record." He nodded. "I'll file it. But Richard, as a friend, drop this." I left, knowing I'd just burned a professional relationship, but I also knew I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. I spent the next week doing something I'd been avoiding since my meeting with Tom Morrison. I started digging through old records, looking for patterns that might validate what I'd seen. The Multnomah County Library had microfiche records of local newspapers going back 50 years. I spent 3 days there, scrolling through decades of reporting. Most of it was routine logging accidents, hunting season updates, high school sports, occasional human interest pieces about life in the mountain communities. But buried in those routine reports, I found threads that made the hair on my neck stand up. October 1978. Livestock disappearances near Ripple Brook. 3 calves gone from a pasture overnight. No blood, no drag marks, fence undisturbed. The rancher told the reporter something had scared his cattle so badly that half the herd tried to break through the fence line. Fish and Wildlife blamed cougars, but the rancher insisted no cougar could carry off a 300-pound calf without leaving some trace. June 1984. A Forest Service fire crew working near Timothy Lake reported finding structures made from bent saplings. The crew chief described them as not natural, like someone was building shelters. The official report classified them as storm damage, but one crew member was quoted saying he'd heard wood knocking sounds the night before they found the structures. September 1991. A bow hunter reported seeing something large and upright watching him from across a ravine. He described it as bigger than any bear, moving through heavy brush without making sound. The article treated it as a curiosity piece, but reading it now, knowing what I knew, the hunter's description was precise and credible. He never used the word Bigfoot. Just kept saying it wasn't an animal, and it was watching me the way I watch elk. I took notes on everything, cross-referenced locations, built a timeline that showed a pattern of unusual activity in the Clackamas watershed going back decades. Then I requested access to internal Forest Service archives, the incident logs and ranger reports that never made it to public view. My retired employee status gave me access, and nobody questioned my research request. That's where I found the 1,976 documents. They were buried deep in the filing system, classified under Wildlife Management Miscellaneous. A series of memos between district rangers and regional supervisors discussing what they carefully termed unexplained primate activity in the Clackamas and Mount Hood wilderness areas. The memos were professional, measured, never sensationalist. Nobody used the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch. They talked about large bipedal animals of unknown species, unusual track findings, and credible sightings by trained personnel. One memo, dated August 12, 1976, documented a sighting by a Forest Service biologist, someone like me, who'd observed a large primate-like creature near Bagby Hot Springs. The biologist had taken photographs, collected hair samples, made plaster casts of tracks. The memo discussed how to handle the evidence without creating public concern or attracting unwanted attention to the area. I read that line 3 times. They'd had physical evidence, photographs, samples, and they'd buried it. The final memo in the series, dated November 1976, recommended that all such reports be classified as inconclusive wildlife encounters and filed without further investigation. The reasoning was explicit. Given the lack of definitive proof and the potential for public speculation and media attention, it is recommended that reports of this nature be documented but not publicized. Continued investigation would require resources that cannot be justified, without conclusive evidence, and would risk departmental reputation. I photographed every page with my phone, made sure I had a complete record before someone decided these documents shouldn't be accessible anymore. When I left the archives that afternoon, I felt vindicated and furious at the same time. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the first credible observer to see something impossible and be dismissed. There was a pattern here, a history of sightings and evidence that had been systematically buried for institutional convenience. But I also knew this discovery wouldn't change anything. These were internal memos from 40 years ago. They proved the Forest Service had documented similar encounters and decided not to pursue them. They didn't prove those encounters were real. A skeptic could argue they just showed that the agency had dealt with Bigfoot reports in the past and correctly determined they weren't credible. I needed something more, something current, something that couldn't be dismissed as old rumors or institutional paranoia. 3 days after my visit to the archives, Tom Morrison called. "Richard, I passed your report up the chain. State Wildlife Division wants to follow up. Officer Janet Kowalski will be contacting you to schedule a site visit. Finally, someone willing to actually look at the evidence." "When?" I asked. "She'll call you directly. But Richard, this is your one chance. If the state investigates and finds nothing, that's the end of it. No more reports, no more requests for investigation. Understood?" "Understood." I hung up, knowing this was it. My one opportunity to have someone with authority examine the site and validate what I'd found. If Janet Kowalski came back empty-handed, I'd have to accept that my evidence would never be officially recognized. But I also knew that 2 weeks had passed since my initial sighting. Weather had been moving through. Scavengers had time to work on the carcass. The chances of finding anything conclusive were dropping every day. I just had to hope there was something left to find. Janet Kowalski arrived at my house on a cold November morning, 3 weeks after my initial sighting. She was professional, maybe late 30s, wearing outdoor gear that showed actual field use rather than REI showroom shine. We spent 2 hours going over my documentation, the photographs, the measurements, the GPS coordinates, my field notes, with their detailed observations. She asked good questions. What time of day was the sighting? What were the exact weather conditions? What magnification was I using? How did I estimate the distance and size? The kind of questions that showed she was taking this seriously, or at least seriously enough to document it properly. But I could also see the skepticism in how she handled my evidence, the way she examined the photographs of the tracks, looking for inconsistencies, the careful neutrality when I showed her the obsidian blade I'd collected, the passive voice she used, this could be interpreted as, rather than, this is. When can we go out to the site? I asked. Weather forecast shows a brief window this Friday, before another storm system moves in. If we're going to investigate, it needs to be then. I'll be ready. Pack for overnight camping. The site is remote enough that we'll need to stay out there if we want to do a thorough examination. And Mr. Hayward, I need you to manage your expectations. 3 weeks have passed. Weather has moved through. The likelihood of finding conclusive evidence is extremely low. I understood what she wasn't saying. This was a formality. She was going through the motions because Tom Morrison had forwarded my report and protocol required follow-up, but she'd already decided nothing would come of it. We drove out to the trailhead early Friday morning. The temperature was in the low 30s, patches of snow visible at higher elevations. The landscape had changed dramatically from my October visit. The autumn colors were gone, replaced by the gray-brown of approaching winter. The hike up took about the same time as before, but the terrain felt different, harder, less forgiving. Janet set a good pace. She was clearly comfortable in the backcountry, and we reached my observation ridge around 3 in the afternoon. My heart sank when I saw it. Snow. 2 feet of it, covering everything. The observation blind I'd constructed was collapsed under the weight, barely visible as a mound of white-covered deadfall. The valley below was pristine and white, all traces of my previous presence erased by weather. Janet photographed everything anyway. The ridge position, the sightlines to the valleys, the general terrain features. Professional documentation of a site that no longer held any useful evidence. "Can we reach the location where you found the deer carcass?" she asked. "It's about a 2-hour descent from here, but it'll be buried under snow, too." She checked her watch, calculated the remaining daylight. "Let's set up camp here. We'll go down at first light tomorrow, document what we can find, and hike out by afternoon." We set up our tents in what had been my observation area. Janet had quality gear, a 4-season tent, cold weather sleeping bag, the kind of equipment that suggested she took her field work seriously, even if she didn't believe what she was investigating. That night, as we ate a cold dinner in the dropping temperatures, she asked a question that surprised me. "Off the record, what do you think you saw?" "I don't think. I know what I saw." "All right, what did you see?" I described those 17 seconds again. The fluid movement, the conscious awareness, the profile that was primate but wrong. She listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. "Have you considered that maybe there's a more conventional explanation?" she asked carefully. "That stress, or fatigue, or the magnification created an interpretation that felt real but wasn't accurate?" "I've considered every possibility, Officer Kowalski. I've spent 3 weeks trying to find an explanation that doesn't require me to believe the impossible. But the evidence, the tracks, the tool use, the systematic butchery, all of it points to something with intelligence beyond any known species. Or it points to confirmation bias. You saw something unusual, your brain filled in the gaps, and now you're interpreting ambiguous evidence to support that interpretation." I didn't argue. There was no point. She'd made up her mind before she ever arrived at my house. The next morning, we hiked down to the valley where I'd found the carcass. As I'd predicted, everything was buried. The clearing was scoured clean. Snow, weather, and scavengers had erased all traces. Janet dug test holes in several spots, searching for bone fragments or any residual evidence. She found nothing. We were about to head back when we discovered the tree structures. They were about 50 yards north of where the carcass had been. Multiple young Douglas firs bent and woven together in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Not broken, but bent, with the trunk still living but formed into shapes that natural growth wouldn't create. Janet moved closer, examining them carefully. She pulled out her camera and photographed from multiple angles. She tested the bent trunks, noting how much force would be required to bend them into those positions. "Storm damage," she said finally. "We had significant winds 2 weeks ago. Probably bent these saplings over and they froze in position with the snow. Look at how they're woven together. That's not random wind damage. Wind can create unusual patterns, and with heavy snow loading." She took another photograph. "I'll document this as a natural formation with unusual characteristics." I knew what she was doing. She was covering herself, acknowledging the anomaly but explaining it away, maintaining the professional skepticism her position required. The trees were too unusual to ignore completely, but not unusual enough to support any extraordinary claims. We spent another hour searching the area, but there was nothing else to find. The valley was pristine and empty, all traces of my previous visit erased by 3 weeks of weather. As we hiked back toward our camp, I felt the weight of failure settling over me. I'd had one chance to bring someone with authority to see the evidence, and weather had erased it all. But that night, everything would change again. We reached our camp around noon, exhausted and cold. Janet spent an hour organizing her documentation while I prepared lunch. Neither of us talked much. We both knew this investigation was essentially over. No tracks, no carcass remains, no physical evidence beyond some bent trees that could be explained as storm damage. "I need to retrieve some equipment I left at my original observation blind," I said after we'd eaten. "It's about 30 minutes from here." Janet nodded, focused on her laptop. "I'll finish up my site documentation. Be back before it gets dark. Another storm's moving in tonight." I hiked to my old position alone, following my GPS coordinates through snow that had drifted unevenly across the ridge. The temperature was dropping, probably into the 20s. My breath came out in thick clouds. I found the site easily enough, the collapsed remains of my observation blind, the rock I'd used as a seat, the small depression where my tent had been pitched. I started gathering the equipment I'd cached here. A spare rainfly, some rope, a few items I'd left thinking I might return. That's when I saw them. Tracks. Fresh tracks in snow that had fallen after the storm. Massive barefoot prints, 14 inches long, circling the area where I'd set up my observation position weeks earlier. My hands started shaking as I pulled out my camera. These weren't old tracks distorted by weather. These were fresh, maybe from last night or early this morning. The edges were crisp, the depth consistent with recent passage. Something had been here. Recently. Something that had walked through my old camp, examining where I'd sat, where I'd positioned my scope, where my tent had been. The prints circled the entire area in a pattern that suggested careful, deliberate observation. I photographed everything, my heart hammering. While I'd been down in the valley with Janet, something had come up here, had studied my observation site, had examined the location where I'd spent days watching wildlife. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about me having seen something weeks ago. This was current, active. Something was tracking my presence in these mountains, studying my patterns the same way I'd been studying wildlife for 3 decades. I was being observed, assessed, and whatever was doing, the watching had been here within the last 24 hours. I gathered my equipment quickly, suddenly very aware of how alone I was, how exposed this ridgeline position was, how something could be watching me right now from the tree line 50 yards away. The hike back to camp felt longer than 30 minutes. I kept checking over my shoulder, kept scanning the tree line, kept listening for sounds that would tell me I wasn't alone. Janet was outside her tent when I arrived, and one look at my face told her something had happened. "You need to come with me," I said. "Now, there are fresh tracks at my old observation site." She grabbed her documentation kit without argument, and we headed back through the snow. Janet knelt beside the tracks, her camera clicking steadily. She took measurements, photographed from multiple angles, noted the depth and spacing. Professional documentation without comment. I watched her work, waiting for her to acknowledge what we were both seeing. These tracks were fresh, crisp edges, clear detail, recent enough that they had to have been made sometime in the last day. These could be old prints, she said finally, still photographing. Distorted by snow, melt, and refreeze cycles, the edges can look sharp even on tracks that are days old if conditions are right. "Janet, look at the pattern. They circle my entire observation site. That's not random animal movement, that's systematic examination." Or it's a trackway that happens to pass through this area, and you're seeing pattern where there's coincidence. She stood up, checking her images. I'm documenting these as unknown tracks of indeterminate age found at the site. There it was. The philosophical divide between us laid bare. She needed irrefutable proof, something that couldn't be explained any other way. I knew what I was seeing, evidence that something intelligent had been here recently, studying the location where I'd spent days observing wildlife. "You heard them last night," I said. "The wood knocks, you recorded them. I recorded sounds that I can't definitively classify. That's not the same as proof of an unknown species." We hiked back to camp in silence. The temperature had dropped further, and snow had started falling, light flurries that would build into the storm system Janet had mentioned. We'd need to break camp and head out first thing in the morning. That night, we both heard them again. Wood knocks, coming from multiple directions around our camp. Clear, deliberate sounds that seemed to respond to each other across the distance. Not random. Not wind or trees cracking in the cold. Communication. I lay in my tent, listening. Janet was in her tent 20 feet away, and I knew she was hearing the same sounds. I could imagine her lying there with her audio recorder running, documenting sounds she'd later classify as inconclusive. Around midnight, the knocks stopped. The forest went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of normal night sounds, but the heavy silence that meant something large was nearby. I lay awake for hours, listening to that silence, knowing something was out, there in the darkness. When dawn came gray and cold, we broke camp without discussing the night sounds. Janet's report would document everything professionally: the investigation, the lack of definitive evidence, the unusual but explainable observations. My report would be classified as investigated and closed. As we hiked out that morning, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I'd crossed into knowledge that couldn't be shared through conventional channels, truth that existed outside professional acceptance. I could document it, archive it, share it with people who'd had similar experiences, but I could never prove it, not in ways that would satisfy the burden of proof required by science or institutions. Some truths live at the edges of our knowledge, and I just learned I'd be carrying this one alone. I'm writing this 5 years after those 17 seconds changed everything. 5 years of living with knowledge I can't share through conventional channels. 5 years of understanding that some truths exist outside professional acceptance. The experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. I no longer hike alone in remote wilderness areas. I avoid certain valleys in the Cascades despite spending decades there fearlessly. When I'm at our cabin, I catch myself checking the tree line, watching for movement that doesn't belong. Linda notices. She doesn't push, but I see her watching me sometimes, measuring how much that October morning altered who I am. She understands I crossed a line I can't uncross, that I know something about the world that most people will never believe. I kept my promise to her. I didn't go back to the Clackamas watershed, didn't pursue more field studies, didn't try to prove what I saw. Instead, I archived everything: photographs, recordings, measurements, field notes, created detailed files with all my documentation, stored them securely, not for publication, but as a record. Something that could exist even if I never share it, publicly. And I found others. That shadow community I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Sarah Chen, the primatologist who had her own encounter in Olympic National Forest, a wildlife photographer in Montana with audio recordings he can't explain, a retired park ranger from Northern California with multiple sightings over 20 years, all credible people, all carrying knowledge they can't share professionally. We validate each other's experiences, share observations, help each other live with understanding that exists outside accepted frameworks. It's not much, but it matters. Knowing you're not alone in having seen the impossible. I think about the creature often, about intelligence and awareness, about the choice it made to cross that talus slope in daylight, to let me see it for 17 seconds, about how it came back later to study my observation position, to circle my boot prints, to assess whether I was a threat. I think it was communication, maybe a warning, maybe just curiosity. Maybe an acknowledgement that we'd observed each other across a divide neither of us fully understands. Some mysteries are meant to remain at the edges of our knowledge. Some species are wise enough to stay hidden, and some of us carry impossible truths in silence, because the world isn't ready to hear them. That's the real cost of what I saw. I'm sharing this testimony now for a specific reason. Not to convince skeptics, I know better than that, but to validate others who've seen something impossible and been dismissed. If you're reading this because you've had a similar experience, because you've observed something that doesn't fit accepted frameworks, because you've been told you misidentified or imagined what you saw despite your training and credentials, you're not alone. There are more of us than you realize. Credible professionals carrying knowledge we can't share publicly. I believe something exists in the remote wilderness of North America, an intelligent primate species that has survived by being smarter about concealment than we are about detection. They use tools, build structures, communicate across distances. They demonstrate awareness and capability that suggests cultural learning passed down through generations. And they actively avoid human documentation. They understand what cameras mean, what pursuit leads to. They've learned, over decades or centuries, that staying hidden is survival. The ecological implications are staggering. The ethical questions about pursuit and proof are complex. But mostly, I believe some mysteries are perhaps meant to remain unsolved. That wisdom sometimes looks like choosing to stay hidden. I'll never return to those mountains. Not because I'm afraid, though there's that too, but because going back would be disrespectful. They let me see what they wanted me to see. They assessed me, studied my patterns, and ultimately allowed me to leave. Pushing further would violate something I can't quite articulate but deeply understand. So I'm putting this testimony out there for those who need to hear it. For the people who will encounter something impossible and know they'll be dismissed. For the witnesses who understand that some truths exist outside institutional acceptance. Here's what I know. There are places in these mountains where humans aren't apex predators. Where something watches from the shadows with intelligence equal to our own. Where the wilderness holds secrets that choose to remain hidden not from inability but from wisdom. Once you've locked eyes with something that shouldn't exist, once you've understood you're being studied rather than doing the studying, the world is never quite the same. You can believe this or not. That's your choice. But if you go into those mountains, understand this. You might not be alone. And if you see something impossible, document it, trust your observations, and know that others have seen it too. Just don't expect anyone to believe you.